Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see some new faces here, and I just want to say on behalf of the Democratic Party of Santa Cruz County, we're glad to see you, and this is one of several occasional community democratic dialogues, and Hugh McIsaac is the brains behind this idea, bringing together some respected voices to deal with some of the really knotty issues that we face. And so I do want to thank you for organizing this. We want to thank, of course, the Santa Cruz Police Department for use of this room, all the volunteers that helped organize it, Community TV for taping, and this will be rebroadcast throughout the coming months. So Hugh did give a little introduction, but I know there are some new faces here, so I want to do a little bit more about the background, because what we have here is an amazing brain trust of public service, really, between Fred and Ryan. Fred goes back, I had to look this all up, but it's really impressive. Over 3 decades of public service to Santa Cruz County. He started as...
It's amazing, because he's only 26 years old.
It's a time warp. Fred started in 1980 as an aide to then County Supervisor Joe Kuchera, who served the San Lorenzo Valley. He then went on to be Chief of Staff for Sam Farr, who was at that time in the State Assembly. In 1988 through 1996, Fred served as a county supervisor back here in Santa Cruz County, again serving San Lorenzo Valley. At that time, it was particularly close to my heart. Fred's shown leadership in so many areas, but as a county supervisor, among many other things, he led the formation of the Central Coast Alliance for Health, which was a particularly innovative and successful model for delivering health care to Medi-Cal clients, both more cost-effectively and medically more effectively than other models. And that has gone on to grow and serve many other counties, so I'm particularly grateful for that lasting contribution. Fred then, in 1998, was elected to the State Assembly, served till 2003, and in that capacity showed great leadership in areas such as budget, environment, marine protection, among other things, served as Speaker Pro Tem. From 2005, back in Santa Cruz County, and this is quite a remarkable career, going back and forth between the local community and the state level. 2005 to the present, Fred has served as our county treasurer, and in all these 3 decades of public service, he's been through and witnessed and been a part of several boom and bust cycles of the economy, the state of affairs for the state and local government, and seen the response. Ryan Coonerty, I would say, is a Renaissance man, Santa Cruz guy, graduated from Santa Cruz High, played on the football team, happen to know. We give all the details. After his law degree, went back to Washington, D.C., worked in some offices there. He was elected to the Santa Cruz City Council in 2004 and again in 2008. He's now in his 2nd term as mayor. He's active on a number of fronts in terms of local businesses. Of course, he comes from the great bookshop Santa Cruz dynasty. No longer directly involved, but involved in the locally owned business alliance, and also is one of the founders and principals in Santa Cruz NextSpace, Center for Co-working and Innovation. So very interested in economic development and in a new way of growing our local economy. He's a lecturer at UCSC in legal studies, at Cabrillo in political science. He's been involved in numerous community activities, including Dientes Community Dental Clinic, Santa Cruz Community Credit Union. Author of Etched in Stone, a beautiful book with inscriptions in our national monuments, very inspiring. As a council member, he's been involved in promoting economic development and really bringing a new generation into civic participation. So that's a quick bio for both of them, but but I think, it's very impressive. So welcome to both of you. I think sometimes everyone thinks, oh, I know Ryan, I know Fred, but it's impressive histories for both of you. So there you are. So what we've asked both of them to do, because of their experience at the local level and the broader field. And I should say Ryan is not only a small town mayor, he's regularly asked to speak at national meetings and is invited to international programs that help promote a new generation of leadership. So much more than a big frog in a small pond. So we've asked them to look at this this issue that seems so overwhelming to us, the state budget crisis, which is not new this year. It's been looming and growing on us for at least a decade. I know Fred's been involved in earlier efforts to resolve it, but it's really crashing down upon us. A combination of reality and political gamesmanship, I would say, running up against each other with some structural governance issues that I'm sure, Fred, you'll get into those, that make it all harder to deal with and harder to solve. So I thought I'd ask them to reflect on how did we get here? What have we attempted to do in the past? Why is it so hard to make progress? And what should we be doing? And how is it affecting this, as Hugh said, how is this affecting us on a day-to-day basis? We know it's affecting delivery of safety net services, higher education, public education, our transit district, our local services, our schools. So I think no matter what your endeavor is, we're all feeling the impact of the rotten economy magnified by the state budget crisis. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys. And Fred, why don't you start in?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the kind introduction. It's always a privilege to share time with Cynthia Mathews, who has done so much in this community as an elected official, as well as her extensive volunteer work throughout the community, especially with Planned Parenthood, and with Ryan. It is a unique privilege to be able to do that. And thank you, Democrats, for having this evening. Let me try to look at the issue of the state and the condition of the finances of the state and the ability of the state to do or not do anything from a couple of points of view. One is, let's distinguish what's going on now, which is very clearly the result of the current economic situation. So we're not different than Texas, which is not different than New York. The big states are all having the same kind of problem. The governor of Texas is trying to solve a $15 billion problem. Andrew Cuomo is trying to solve an $18 billion problem in New York. We're trying to fix a $26 billion problem in California. That's distinguishable from the kinds of budget problems that we've had for more like a decade and a half in California, where we are either in a surplus or a deficit, but oftentimes we've got what's called an overhang or a structural deficit in California that has nothing to do with the normal business cycle. So what is that about? It's about a couple of things. One, it's about, and this is not an attack on Prop 13, it is simply a real life consequence. In June of 1978, the voters of the state of California were told that essentially widows and orphans were being thrown out in the snow and losing their houses because property taxes were out of control. And the basis upon which that statement was made was that local government folks had a dial-o-matic. And what they would do is they would decide what level of police service, fire service, parks and recreation, public works, etc. do we want to have in our community. They would make that decision in public with public hearings, and then they would go to their property tax dial-o-matic and say, well, that means we need the property tax rate to be at this level. And according to those who supported Proposition 13 at the time, these people at local government were not caring about whether that dial-o-matic was affordable for people, especially seniors and others who lived on fixed incomes. That was the story. And that if what you did was that you passed Proposition 13, you would fix the property tax rate at 1%. And that could not be changed except by a 2/3 vote of the electorate. What happened when the voters approved that is that in one night, every local government in the state of California lost 60% of their general fund revenue. So imagine if tomorrow morning you woke up and you had 60% less coming in your paycheck or your Social Security check or whatever it might be. Your income and your family got cut by 60%. What would you do? First thing you do is you just try to say, well, my goodness, there must be some things I can do here to cut, squeeze, and trim. But most people, like most local governments, frankly, are functioning not with a whole bunch of excess, not with a whole bunch of waste, fraud, and abuse, not with a whole bunch of wonderful, luxurious things that they could do without, so it'd be easy to cut 60%. You might be able to cut 15%. You might, if you really went at it, able to cut 25%. But the community would be fundamentally different very, very quickly, even at a 25% cut rate. The state, at the very same time that local governments lost 60% of their revenue in one night, the state, with a governor by the name of, what was it again? Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown was the governor at the time, and the state was sitting on a $5 billion surplus. Now that's at a time when $5 billion meant something. And because the state's general fund was less than $40 billion. And they were sitting on a $5 billion surplus. So the locals correctly went to the state and said, my goodness, can you help us here? We're in a dire strait and you've got a surplus, can you help us with this? At first, the governor and the legislature said, no, apparently you misunderstood what happened the other night, but the electorate apparently said, you need 60% less revenue, not the state. They didn't say that to us, they said that to you folks who get property taxes. Well, the local government folks said, do you really want to hold to that position? Is that really what you want to do? Because we don't think that's a sustainable political position. And very quickly the state decided that they would share that $5 billion surplus to try to cushion the local governments in terms of cuts. They still had to make cuts, but it wasn't 60% of their revenue. But the state, as you might imagine, think that you go to your kindly old Uncle Ralph and you say, Uncle Ralph, I need $100. And your Uncle Ralph says, oh, I'm glad to do it. Here's $100. Now, let me tell you what clothes you're going to wear. Let me tell you who you're going to date. Let me tell you what food you're going to eat. Let me tell you, what movies you're going to watch. Let me tell you. That's what the state did. The state said, here's your $5 million. And by the way, since that's really our $5 billion, we're going to tell you what you can do and not do. And so what happened is there was an enormous transfer of power from local government to state government. Because quite frankly, once you take the dial-o-matic away from the locals, a lot of their power is gone. Now some people say, good thing, that's great, that's a good thing. But that has fundamentally shifted obligations and responsibilities. The state government, once it did that, decided, well, actually this works out pretty well for us. And so they engaged in a number of transactions over the years that solidified that shift of power to the state level. The state, however, is not local government. They don't deal with land use issues, they're not dealing with public works, they're not dealing with local parks, they do a range of other things. They spend most of their money. When you hear that there is a state budget problem, they are purely talking about a state general fund problem. You never hear Caltrans raised in this issue. You don't hear a whole range of parts of the state government affected by this. And the reason you don't hear them in the conversation is because they're not general fund supported. The state spends its money. The general fund is spent in a handful of areas. K-12 education, the three legs of higher education, health and human services, and prisons. Everything else that the state spends general fund money on is budget dust. It amounts to nothing in the consequence of the entirety of the state budget. So when the state gets itself in the kind of position it's been in for a decade and a half, where the state does not put anything aside in good years for the bad times, what it creates is what's called an overhang. It means that the state has a structural deficit problem that they can't grow their way out of. They can't wait for a good economy to grow them out of it. That's not going to happen. The state ends up in a place very quickly because of their sources of revenue, and this goes to the tax question now, where the tax system that the state relies on overperforms the economy in good times, underperforms the economy in bad times. Here's why. The three sources of the state general fund are the state share of sales tax, the state personal income tax, and the bank and corporation tax. The bank and corporation tax is a very small fraction of that. 50% of the state's revenue comes from personal income tax that you pay to the state of California. About 40% comes from the state's share of sales tax, and the other 10 or so percent is the bank and corporation tax. California treats capital gains as ordinary earned income. That is one of the contributing factors to why the state's general funds overperform the economy in good times, because we treat capital gains as ordinary earned income. We also, at the state level, do not distinguish when we treat capital gains as earned income. We don't distinguish it as one-time revenue, which we should. So, for example, I'm the county treasurer. You're nice enough to elect me to this job. So it's pretty certain that I'm going to have my income this year, and I'll pay state income tax on it, and then next year, and I'll pay state income tax on it, and the next year and the next year for my 4-year term. You can kind of expect that's going to happen. Now, if during that 4-year period, I happen to have a good year in terms of my own personal investments, and I want to sell something, sell some equities, sell some stock in order to take a trip or buy another crappy car like the one I have now or whatever, then I am taxed on that capital gain that I have. But I'm only going to sell that stock one time. And the state's only going to get the capital gain one time. But the state treats it as if it is ongoing income. That really, really hurts in the downside of the business cycle, because the state projects on the upside of the business cycle that all of that income is continuing income and ordinary income and recurring income when it isn't. So you've got a set of tax problems over here that need curing. There's a number of issues over here where we spend our money that are worth examining. And then we get to what I think is a separate suite of issues, and that is the budgeting process in California, which contributes as much to the difficulties in getting a budget and getting a budget on time and getting a budget that's worth waiting for as any of the other things I've mentioned. For example, until last year, California was one of 3 states in the United States that required a 2/3 vote to get a budget. California, Rhode Island, and Arkansas. That meant that the Democrats in both houses of the legislature, where they control both houses of the legislature and have substantial majorities, but they don't have 2/3 vote, needed to get Republicans to vote for the budget. The Republicans consistently extracted the following as their price for voting for the budget. Number 1, no tax increases. Number 2, tax breaks, tax reductions for targeted industries. So imagine last year when the state was cutting $40 billion over an 18-month period, and the price for getting that budget that had those cuts in it was that you had to give $9 billion in tax breaks to California corporations at the same time. It's an interesting way to try to do business. So the voters of California...
And you might say it has a familiar ring.
Has a familiar ring. The voters of California changed that, and so this year, for the first time in a long time, California can adopt a budget by majority vote, and the Democrats have the majority in both houses. The reason that hasn't happened yet is because the governor, and I think correctly, wanted to take this problem and solve it by cutting half the problem, about $12.5 billion, leaving K-12 out of that cut scenario, and continue 3 existing taxes at their current levels that are scheduled to drop down on July 1st. The Republicans would not do that. They wouldn't even agree to put that on the ballot to let you decide that. So now what's happening is that the governor and the legislature are going to essentially Plan B. That Plan B looks something like this. Mostly cuts on a majority vote basis, but not $26 billion worth. Also on a majority vote, call a special election for November, creating the time for a ballot initiative which would put a 1% surtax on all income over $1 million and have that go into the general fund in order to prevent the cuts in K-12 education. That's essentially the plan from here. But really what has to happen, it seems to me, is that in addition to the change we made on the 2/3 requirement and changing to a majority vote budget, we need to do a couple of other things in the budget process. Go to 2-year budgeting. Go to a process that is the best practice in states that operate well, and I don't mean just Democratic states, Republican states, Democratic states that manage their fiscal affairs well. Most of them are on a 2-year budget cycle, and what they also do is they set very specific outcomes for the budget, essentially entering into a contract between the legislature and the governor and those agencies that are going to be spending money. And not measuring outputs, not how many prisoners do we have in jail, not how many miles did we pave of roads, not how many cute little noses are in the K-12 school system, not that. That's outputs. It's outcome-based. If you can measure it, you can manage it. It also helps you have a coherence about what the government is trying to do. And it allows you to distinguish successful from unsuccessful efforts to achieve those outcomes. And that rewards creativity and initiative inside a system which is largely very calcified and not open and friendly to change. So 2-year budgeting, management by objectives, mandatory oversight by the legislature of the executive branch in the second year of the 2-year session, and a requirement that when you're on the upside of the business cycle, you take and dedicate general fund revenue to a lockbox that can't be used unless you're on the downside of the business cycle in order to avoid the kind of deficits we're in now. So that's a snapshot. How did we get into this? Where are we right now? How can we try to manage through this right now? But I will tell you this in my last comment, and I know I've gone on too long, and the mayor's terribly extends great forbearance to me, and I appreciate that. The governor's budget that he proposed in January, which still can happen. It just isn't going to happen in the same order, in the same way, and so on. But the concept is structurally sound. Both the Legislative Analyst's Office, the Department of Finance, and outside analysts who have looked at it have said this budget not only holds together now, it holds together for the entire 4 years that Brown is going to be governor. This is a shift fundamentally in how the state budgets. And that is what has to happen, I think, as the critical political component to this, which is that governors for many, many years have gotten themselves to balance budgets. And as you've seen, for example, last year, we had 4 separate budgets for the state of California. Not one budget lasted more than 3 months. You can't do that at your home. You can't do it in a small business. You can't do it in the city of Santa Cruz. You can't do it at Planned Parenthood. You can't do it any place. And you sure as hell can't do it in the state of California with a $100 billion enterprise. So one of the real virtues of what the governor is doing is that he has proposed a plan that moves for 4 years and holds together. And then I think creates the political space for us to also be able to undertake governance reforms of the nature that I talked about. Thank you.
I should tell you to start, I'm violating my rule. I have a rule where I don't follow Fred Keeley when he talks about public policy. So Cynthia put me in this position, so blame her if I fall short. I want to, the effect on the local level, I want to talk a little bit because the local governments have perfected the art of complaining about Sacramento and judging them for how they could do business better. And I want to do a little bit of that, and then I want to talk a little bit about why I don't blame Sacramento quite as much as maybe some other local governments. So the city of Santa Cruz budget annually, plus or minus, is about $200 million a year. But like the state, only about $60 million of that is what we sort of are constantly fighting about and arguing about and everything else. Well, I should say Santa Cruz, we can argue about anything. So we actually do argue about the other $140 million, but it's a different context. So the general fund, the $140 million, if you wonder what that money goes to, that goes to the water delivery, where we're putting clean water into your house and taking dirty water out. We're picking up refuse and running the landfill, the golf course, the downtown parking district. These are all enterprise funds where they basically pay for themselves, and we're not allowed to charge you more than it costs us to deliver those services. The remaining amount of the money goes to the things that make a huge difference in this community. It's police, fire, parks, our support for social services, and then all the little bits of money it takes to run the city. Over the past decade, we have had to make tremendous cuts. That what is now probably about a $55 million general fund budget, at one time was over a $70 million budget. But sort of unlike the state, who can engage in some interesting accounting at times that would make the folks on Wall Street proud, we have to balance our budget every year. We only have so much money, and we have to make it balance every year. So we have made tremendous cuts that actually hurt the soul of those of us who ran for office, not to shut down the pools, cut off funding for the museums, reduce library hours, reduce the number of city employees that we have maintaining our parks and taking care of essential services, cutting social service programs, which in this time are the fundamental safety net of our community. We've cut those over 48% over the past bunch of years because we have to balance the budget. And I should also note, unlike Sacramento, we've raised taxes 4 out of the 5 times we've gone to the voters and had to raise taxes. So in a way, we have a much more honest conversation with our citizenry than I think Sacramento has had with the state of California, which is to say, we simply cannot provide you all the services that we once did, and we have to raise your taxes in order to provide you, frankly, some level less of services. But that's what it takes to balance our budget. The city of Santa Cruz just had our bond rating upgraded to an A+ bond rating. We have one of the highest bond ratings in the state of California. Now, I say that because, one, there's been a lot of attention lately on some of the cities like Bell, California, and some of the people, Vallejo has gone into bankruptcy. And the assumption is that all the cities have just sort of been throwing money away over the years, and now find themselves, the famous Warren Buffett quote that when the tide goes out, you can see who's been swimming naked, that we have all been exposed as having swum naked. We, in fact, have had a healthy reserve. We have paid our debts. One of the ironic things is in the proposal to take away the redevelopment fund, the city of Santa Cruz was going to be punished more severely in that case because we didn't spend all our redevelopment dollars. We were very conservative. We only spent money on the projects that we thought were useful, and we only bonded out when we knew we could pay it back. And so because we had extra reserves in our redevelopment, the state was actually going to take more money away from us than some of the cities that were just sort of throwing money everywhere. So we've had that honest conversation. We've had to make huge cuts and tax increases in order to balance it out. And that's what we have to do as a city, and that's what we will continue to do. This year, we're seeking compensation reductions, total compensation reductions from every employee in the city of 10%. And that's not just 10% wages, but that's also their health benefits, that includes their health benefits, their pension costs, and everything else. Where we've gotten rough agreements with about 5 of the 7, and we're working towards agreements with everybody else. After we do that, we still will have to cut about $2 million more in services we provide, and that'll go to the core services because we've now cut away everything extraneous, and we're now cutting to the basic core services we can provide. And so that's where we are as a city. From my view, from sort of the city looking up at Sacramento, in part, I blame them for not having that honest conversation that we had to have over the last decade of asking you to write more out of your pocketbooks and reduce services in order to balance our budget. I think Governor Brown, to his credit, is having that honest conversation for the first time. And I think those, especially in the Republican Party, are being exposed for actually not having any viable solution to balance this budget. And I think it's helpful that I think Californians are coming to a place where they understand the reality that's in front of them. Now, the problem is with the structural deficits, the problem has gotten more difficult to fix over the years because you have these structural deficits. So that's where I blame Sacramento. Where I give them some leeway is I believe that Sacramento, and I wrote this in a column I wrote for the Los Angeles Times, that California has a democracy problem. That we have structural problems where we have set a game, the rules of which it's impossible to win. And in my classes, I talk about this all the time. Imagine if you're playing basketball and you have the same 5 players on each side, the same point system, so you have 2 points and 3-pointers. So now raise the rim to 25 feet. Same players, same rules, but you're going to change the nature of the game. Lower the rim to 2 feet. You're going to change who the best players are. And I tell my students to not play games in which they cannot win, right? Understand the rules of the game, understand the games in which that they have an opportunity to win. If they can set the rules, even better. But at the very least, don't keep playing a game in which you cannot win. I believe the state legislators are in a position where they're playing a game they simply cannot win. When they walk in the door, and Fred can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe 86% of their budget's already been decided by voter referendum. So all that leaves on the table when you're making cuts are the groups that basically are not powerful enough to run statewide initiatives, which are higher education, meaning community colleges, CSUs and UCs, and the poor, who don't have a statewide lobby to put a ballot measure. So that when you have to make cuts, those are the people that are going to take the hits the hardest. The K through 12 have protected themselves to some extent. Local governments have protected themselves to some extent. The prison system has protected itself to some extent. But so the legislatures don't have much room to begin with when you're talking about deficits this size. Then if you talk about some of the structural things, and you talk about a 2/3 budget, the inability to raise taxes, the redistricting, and this is a case in which Fred and I disagree with the Democratic Party about whether you want to have sort of partisan drawn districts or whether you want to have citizen drawn districts that allow for more moderates, frankly, on both sides, who maybe get people together and find a solution rather than people who are locked in on the right and left sides of the political spectrum. So you have that structure. Finally, so that I think it's very difficult, unless you make governance reforms in California, very difficult to make any changes. The last thing I want to talk about is an arcane tax structure which hurts both the state and localities. If on the west side, if we take one of the old factory buildings that's since been closed down, and we allow a research and development center, whether it's run by UCSU or a private entity, that is literally doing research that will cure cancer, the city loses money on its tax base. If we add housing to the top of that, that allows people not to have to get in their car and allows people to have an affordable place to live, we lose even more money. If we put in a Walmart, the city as an institution makes out. So all of the incentives we have, and the classic example of this is the Costco here in Santa Cruz, brings in more than twice the revenue as all of downtown combined. So you create a huge incentive for local government to drive their land use policy chasing money rather than what's best for the future of California, what's best for its citizens, what's more livable, what the environmental choice is. And that structure is, we have to change that structure in addition to the governance structure because it's setting all the incentives in the wrong direction. And then lastly, I have to say, as the son of an independent bookseller, the internet sales tax, which costs the state about $4 billion a year, it's an archaic piece of law that was set up to help the internet when it was new and no one knew whether it was going to work or not. Well, I think we can say the internet's going to work out and may stick around for a while, and giving out-of-state companies essentially a 10% tax break over companies that are in our communities that provide jobs and health care and property taxes and sales taxes, and you're basically having consumers you're giving all Californians an incentive to spend their money out of state rather than in state. Makes no sense whatsoever when you're buying the exact same goods. And we're going to have to address that issue, because not only does it cost the state $4 billion a year, which would go a long way towards helping higher education, the social services we care about, K through 12, but it also has a profound impact on our ability to support businesses and the other pieces of our tax break, so we have to continue to look at that.
And I should say, sometimes when we're out there in the public sphere, people say, well, why don't you just blank, blank, blank? Or, you could fix this by blank, blank, blank. I think it's pretty clear that there aren't quick fixes and easy solutions. These threads are so interwoven and so deep. But I know, Fred, you're working on solutions. You want to talk about that now?
Sure. Thank you. So let me pick up on a concept that the mayor was talking about, because I think it's really important relative to whether you can get things done or not get things done in Sacramento. We did two things in the last couple of years that the party that I've been a member of since I was 18 years old, and I'm 60 now, and I'm very proud to be a Democrat, very proud to have been a Democratic member of the California State Legislature. But that doesn't mean I have to agree with my party on every single thing. And I don't agree with my party on two things that the voters did last year that I agreed with the voters on, and I was part of helping make it happen. And that is to establish a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission. And secondly, to have an open primary. One of the major reasons you can't get things done in Sacramento is that the Democratic caucus in Sacramento is further to the left than the Democratic Party is as a whole in California. Secondly, the Republican caucus in Sacramento is significantly to the right of where the Republican Party is as a party in California. And no one in Sacramento is elected to represent the fastest growing party in California, which is no party at all declined to state. Now, if the Democrats and the Republicans want to continue to keep their clubhouse only for themselves, I think what happens is it continues a process where the legislature is unable to do very much at all. And therefore the electorate continues to become not cynical, but not skeptical, but instead becomes cynical and turns off. Now, the open primary and the Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission, for everything that some people are afraid of and say, we don't know what this is going to do, we have no idea what it means, this thing could go any which way, that's not true. We've seen this movie before in California. First, after the 1990 census, the redistricting was not done by the legislature. The legislature tried to do it and couldn't. And so a court did it. And it turned out very well for this area and for the state of California. Democrats continued to have substantial majorities in both houses, and we had an open primary in two successive elections until both the Republicans and the Democrats sued to get rid of the open primary at that time. And by the way, open primaries are like ice cream. They come in lots of flavors. The one that we passed last year as the voters is different than the ones that the Republicans and Democrats sued on and got thrown out. But what we saw when there was an independent redistricting in 1991, and there were open primaries in two primaries and general elections in the 1990s, and I ran in those, is that we ended up with a Democratic caucus that was still in charge of the legislature and had a significant number of moderate Democrats in it, mostly from the Central Valley, mostly from suburbanizing areas. Look, we're always going to send a very lefty Democrat from here. So is Santa Monica, so is Berkeley, so is San Francisco, so is downtown LA. We're going to do that. The Republicans who represent the northeast part of the state and the very rural parts of the state are always going to send very conservative Republicans. The question is, who are the people in the suburbanizing and changing areas of California and the growth of independence in California, where are they going to be heard and how does that play out? And what we know from statewide elections last year is Democrats have nothing to be afraid of. Every state constitutional office is occupied by a Democrat. Both United States senators are Democrats. This is a Democratic state. What will an open primary do together with an independent redistricting? It will take and grow a bigger middle in both caucuses. Not at the expense of the edges, it will grow bigger middles. And you need that bigger middle to get things done. And if you are in charge, which Democrats are now and are going to be into the foreseeable future, you want somebody in the minority that you can work with and get a deal done on education, on environment, on health and human services, on taxes. You want a negotiating partner who can engage in give and take and work things out. So my belief is what you're going to see after the 2012 election is I think you're going to see a couple of things. There will be some reforms of the budgeting process, and those will be in place. I think you're going to see a democratically dominated legislature with a Democratic governor and more moderate and larger middle that will allow negotiations to take place in good faith, which currently I won't say that they don't take place in good faith. The Republicans have a different belief system than we have. They are not bad people. They are not trying to hurt somebody. If that's how you view it, I really suggest that you go to Sacramento and spend some time. They have a different value system and belief system. It's not the one I have, but it's worth listening to, not so you can adopt it, but to understand why it is they can't make a deal that involves raising taxes. It's because the same reason we can't make a deal that says if you simply suspend public funding of women's reproductive health services in the state of California, you could start to balance the budget. There's not a Democrat in the legislature who would vote for that because it's a matter of principle for us. The fact that the Republicans have a principle that says they can't vote for tax increases, we shouldn't laugh at it. We should understand it and figure out how to grow the middle to get some Republicans in the legislature who in fact can vote to increase taxes when they're necessary. And they're necessary now. And they're going to be necessary over the next decade. So I think that's worth Democrats, my colleagues, Democrats who are here, in effect, getting over the fact that we have a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission. I think we're going to end up with a Senate district that you're going to be very happy with, and that's going to elect a Democrat to go to the state Senate, that's going to be based in Santa Cruz and Monterey counties, instead of split between 3 Senate districts where we're the tail on 3 separate dogs. And I think you're going to see a bigger middle. And that bigger middle doesn't mean you're not going to have progressive values in the legislature. They're still going to dominate. But you've now got a counterparty that you can negotiate with.
But I think we need to look at the system as a whole, because what they're facing in Sacramento is every group goes up there and says, you can't cut me, I'm too important. And what we've had is then if you can't get it through the legislature, then you get it through the referendum process and you protect yourself. And it puts, at the end of the day, it will always impact the people who have the least power in the system, because they won't be able to fight back either in the legislature or in the referendum, or it'll trickle down. I mean, last couple of years, the state of California, Sacramento, has stolen about $60 million from the city of Santa Cruz. And when I say steal, I mean that literally, in that it's our money. It went up there because people pay their taxes up there, and then it's supposed to come right back. And the voters have said it, the California Constitution says it, charter cities say it, and they just hold on to it because they're the bank and they can do that. And the reaction we get when we talk to legislators who are well-meaning and believe in what we're doing is, well, if I don't take this money, then I have to make massive cuts to social services, and I can't I can't bring myself to cut programs for the people who are most in need in these times. Well, all they're doing by holding on to that money is forcing us to make those cuts, right? We've had to cut 48% the Second Harvest Food Bank and the homeless shelter and all the different programs that are providing a safety net. So if we're going to solve this, we have to solve it globally. If everyone's out there fighting for their own little piece of the pie, we will never fix the system or get the policies in place to make the difference.
If what you're suggesting is if there was activist mobilization in current Republican districts to try to get them to a place, because all you're trying to do then is either get them to not support cuts, then you have to get them to also support tax increases. I would just say that if you believe that, I would like to see somebody test that theory out. Because I will tell you that I do not know a Republican in the state of California who currently serves in the legislature or served in the last 10 years who that would matter at all the way you want it to matter. And in fact, I think it redounds to their benefit. And let me tell you this story. When I was in the legislature, and the Speaker and I were tasked with trying to come together on a budget and find a solution, we were convinced that we had figured out a way to essentially trap the Republicans into a place where they were going to have to vote for a temporary tax increase. And what we did was that we said we're only going to, for 3 years, substantially increase the tax on all tobacco products. And if you don't do that, if you don't vote with us to temporarily increase tobacco taxes, then the consequence of that is that certain health and human services for kids is going to be cut. And how we thought we were so clever was that no Republican could really go back to their district and say, I'm not going to vote for a tax increase, and instead I'm going to side with big tobacco against little kids. And we thought no Republican could do that. And so we put the proposal out there on a Thursday. The Republicans went home like we did. Everybody came back on Monday. We said, now, you ready to deal? And they said, of course we're not ready to deal. It's a tax increase and we're not going to do it. And they said, well, didn't you catch hell for this? We ran ads in their districts over the weekend in an election year. We had the ads ready to go. We ran them in their districts over that weekend. And what they said is, you apparently don't understand. This is a matter of principle for us. Not a desire, not a preference, not something we'd rather not do. It's a principle. Respect our principle. So if you think that there is some way to get Republicans to vote for tax increases that I'm not aware of, then I do encourage you to do exactly what you described. Because the Republicans aren't going to vote for tax increases with the current construct and the construct for the last 25 years in which Republicans get elected to the California legislature. The only way you're going to get Republicans who will entertain a half cuts, half tax increase proposition is if that person believes that they can sustain that in the next election. And the only way that's going to happen for a Republican is in a top 2 vote-getter primary, the incentive is to run to the middle, not to run to your right. Right now, the total incentive, until we changed and went to a 2 top vote-getter open primary, has been for Democrats to run to their left and Republicans to run to their right, because the primary is the only thing that matters. And you get exactly what you voted for statewide when you do that. So if you want a counterparty with whom you can negotiate, you will never get a counterparty you can negotiate under the system that doesn't allow decline to state to vote and incents Republicans to run to their edges in the primary, and redistricting, which the Speaker of the Assembly, with no sense of irony and no sense of humor, said in 2001 when he destroyed this district as a Senate district for Democrats, said that the reason you should vote for this redistricting plan, which I did not, was that it was an incumbent protection program. You can hunt all day long in the California Constitution on redistricting, and you will never find incumbent protection program as one of the lenses you should look through. There are only 3, the Census, the Voting Rights Act, and communities of interest. And that's going to produce what the legislature couldn't last time. When Barack Obama got elected President of the United States and there was a sweep of Democrats, not one Republican got defeated in California. Not one Republican got defeated and not one Democrat gained a seat in California. The same way as when the Republicans swept last year, not one Democrat got thrown out of office. Why? Because when the legislature gets to pick their voters, they're going to pick the voters that support them, not the voters that are reasonable and going to figure out what's in the interest of the community. So I strongly support this notion that we are going to get a better legislature dominated by Democrats with a bigger middle, and we're going to be better. If you care about public education, environment, health and human services, the correction system that corrects nothing, then you might want to have a legislature that is a little more like the people of the state of California, who are reasonable, good people, who elect Barbara Boxer, who elect Dianne Feinstein, who elect Jerry Brown. Because that's what you're going to get. A legislature that looks more like California is more representative of the middle of California.